Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of 3 videos covering Section 5, Chapter 1 of your McGraw-Hill Geometry textbook. Again, that's Section 1-5, Video 1 of 3 on angle relationships. This section is extremely heavy on vocabulary, all of which will be appearing on vocabulary quizzes. The entire first video will cover vocabulary. The second video will show an example of how we use that vocabulary, as well as a couple of just an example of vocabulary, and the third and final video will show some additional examples. So we'll start with a video over the vocabulary. We'll start with the idea of adjacent angles. Adjacent angles are two angles that share a common vertex and a common side. So if we look at the picture here, we can see that there are two angles, angle WXZ, and angle ZXY. Both have a vertex at X, see? And they share side XZ. So the adjacent angles, think of them as angles that are next to each other. Two angles that share a common vertex and a common side. Now within that idea of adjacent angles, there's one special type of adjacent angles called a linear pair. A linear pair is a pair of adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays. So, for instance, if we wanted to, we could draw a line, draw a ray in, and we could say angles 1 and 2 form a linear pair. Okay? So down here in the picture, you'll notice that we have line AC, because it tells us that a ray BA, which is here, and ray BC are opposite rays, which we should know are collinear rays with a common endpoint that go in opposite directions. What that tells us is that angle CBD, this angle here, CBD, and angle DBA, this angle here, form a linear pair. They are adjacent angles whose non-common sides are opposite rays. Alright, our next set of vocabulary is the idea of vertical angles. Vertical angles, by definition, are non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines. Now what this means is that they will share a common vertex, but they will not share a common side. So in this picture we have 4 angles here, 1, 2, 3, and 4, labeled. Angles 1 and 3 are an example of non-adjacent angles formed by intersecting lines. They are vertical angles, so the top angle and the bottom angle. Similarly, we could use angles 2 and 4 in the exact same way. They are also vertical angles. So vertical angles, we've got 2 sets in this picture. We've got angle 1 and angle 3. Those are vertical angles. And we have angles 2 and 4. Those are vertical angles. Alright, next up we have the idea of complementary angles and supplementary angles. Now in theory these should not be new terms. We should be familiar with these terms. Complementary angles are 2 angles whose measures add up to 90 degrees. And supplementary angles are 2 angles whose measures add up to 180 degrees. And then the final new vocab term of the section is the idea of perpendicular lines. Again, perpendicular should not be a new word to us. Perpendicular lines are lines which intersect to form 4 right angles. Now notice the right angle symbol, this singular square. Okay, if we see a square in the mouth of an angle, that means right angle. So that indicates that those are perpendicular lines. So what we would say is we would say L is perpendicular. That's what this symbol means. L is perpendicular to M. Those are cursive letters because they're lowercase naming lines. Now in this picture, all four angles are congruent. Why? Well, all four angles in that picture are right angles, and all right angles measure 90 degrees each. If their measures are equal, then they are congruent. This is also the only situation where four intersecting lines where adjacent angles are congruent. So the only way that can happen is if the lines that form those adjacent angles are perpendicular. That does it for the vocabulary in this section. Now that was quick and furious, so I'm just going to put this on the end of this. Geometry is a course that is extremely dependent on you understanding vocabulary and notation. So you may want to go back and watch parts of this video again and make sure you know these terms and you know the symbols that go with these terms.